Good evening, dear listeners. Tonight, I bring to you from H.G. Wells, The Island of Dr. Moreau. So settle in, dear listeners, and welcome back to Morbid Whispers, House of Dreams. On February the 1st, 1887, the Lady Vane was lost by collision with a derelict when about the latitude 1 degree south and longitude 107 degrees west. On January the 5th, 1888, that is 11 months and 4 days after, my uncle, Edward Pendrick, a private gentleman, who certainly went aboard the Lady Vane at Callao, and who has been considered drowned, was picked up in latitude 5 degrees 3 minutes south and longitude 101 degrees west, in a small open boat of which the name is illegible, but which is supposed to have belonged to the missing schooner, the Ipecacuanha. He gave such a strange account of himself that he was supposed demented. Subsequently, he alleged that his mind was a blank from the moment of his escape from the Lady Vane. His case was discussed among psychologists at the time as a curious instance of the lapse of memory consequent upon physical and mental stress. The following narrative was found among his papers by the undersigned, his nephew and heir, but unaccompanied by any definite request for publication. The only island to exist in the region in which my uncle was picked up is Noble's Isle, a small volcanic islet and uninhabited. It was visited in 1891 by HMS Scorpion. A party of sailors then landed, but found nothing living thereon except certain curious white moths, some hogs and rabbits, and some rather peculiar rats, so that this narrative is without confirmation in its most essential particular. With that understood, there seems no harm in putting this strange story before the public in accordance, as I believe, with my uncle's intentions. There is at least this much in its behalf. My uncle passed out of human knowledge about latitude 5 degrees south and longitude 105 degrees east, and reappeared in the same part of the ocean after a space of 11 months. In some way he must have lived during the interval, and it seems that a schooner called the Ipecacuanha, with a drunken captain, John Davies, did start from Africa with the puma and certain other animals aboard in January 1887, that the vessel was well known at several ports in the South Pacific, and that it finally disappeared from those seas, with a considerable amount of copra aboard, sailing to its unknown fate from Banya in December 1887, a date that tallies entirely with my uncle's story. Charles Edward Pendrick. Chapter 1. In the Dinghy of the Lady Vane. I do not suppose to add anything to what has already been written concerning the loss of the Lady Vane. As everyone knows, she collided with a derelict when 10 days out from Callao. The longboat, with 7 of the crew, was picked up 8 days after by H.M. gunboat Myrtle, and the story of their terrible privations has become quite as well known as the far from horrible Medusa case. But I have to add to the published story of the Lady Vane another, possibly as horrible and far stranger. It has hitherto been supposed that the 4 men who were in the dinghy perished, but this is incorrect. I have the best of evidence for this assertion. I was one of the 4 men. But in the first place, I must state that there never were 4 men in the dinghy. The number was 3. Constance, who was seen by the captain to jump into the gig, luckily for us and unluckily for him, did not reach us. He came down out of the tangle of ropes under the stays of the smashed bowsprit. Some small rope caught his heel as he let go, and he hung for a moment, head downward, and then fell, struck a block of spar floating in the water. We pulled towards him, but he never came up. Daily News, March 17th, 1887. I say luckily for us he did not reach us, and I might also say luckily for him, for we had only a small beaker of water and some soddened ship's biscuits with us. So sudden had been the alarm, so unprepared the ship for any disaster. We thought the people on the launch would be better provisioned, though it seems they were not, and we tried to hail them. They could not have heard us, and the next morning when the drizzle cleared, which was not until past midday, we could see nothing of them. We could not stand up to look about us because of the pitching of the boat. The 2 other men who had escaped so far were a man named Halmar, a passenger like myself, and a seaman whose name I don't know, a short, sturdy man with a stammer. We drifted famishing, and after our water had come to an end, tormented by an intolerable thirst for 8 days altogether. After the second day, the sea subsided slowly to a glassy calm. It was quite impossible for the ordinary reader to imagine those 8 days. He has not, luckily for himself, anything in his memory to imagine with. After the first day, we said little to one another, and lay in our places in the boat, and stared at the horizon or watched with the eyes that grew larger and more haggard every day, the misery and weakness gaining upon our companions. The sun became pitiless. The water ended on the 4th day, and we were already thinking strange things and saying them with our eyes. But it was, I think, the 6th before Helmar gave voice to the thing we had all been thinking. I remember our voices were dry and thin, so that we bent towards one another and spared our words. What I stood out against it with all my might was rather for scuttling the boat and perishing together amongst the sharks that followed us. But when Helmar said that if his proposal was accepted we should have drink, the sailor came round to him. I would not draw lots, however, and in the night the sailor whispered to Helmar again and again, and I sat in the bows with my clasp knife in hand, though I doubt if I had the stuff in me to fight. And in the morning I agreed to Helmar's proposal, and we handed halfpence to find the odd man. The lot fell upon the sailor, but he was the strongest of us and would not abide by it, and attacked Helmar with his hands. They grappled together and almost stood up. I crawled along the boat to them, intending to help Helmar by grasping the sailor's leg, but the sailor stumbled with the swaying of the boat, and the 2 fell upon the gunwale and rolled overboard together. They sank like stones. I remember laughing at that, and wondering why I laughed. The laugh caught me suddenly, like a thing from without. I lay across one of the thwarts for I know not how long, thinking that if I had the strength I would drink sea water and madden myself to die quickly. And even as I lay there, I saw, with no more interest than if it had been a picture, a sail come up towards me over the skyline. My mind must have been wandering, and yet I remember all that happened quite distinctly. I remember how my head swayed with the seas, and the horizon with the sail above it danced up and down. But I also remember as distinctly that I had a persuasion that I was dead, and that I thought what a jest it was that they should come too late by such a little to catch me in my body. For an endless period, as it seemed to me, I lay with my head on the thwart watching the schooner. She was a little ship, schooner rigged fore and aft, come up out of the sea. She kept tacking to and fro in the widening compass, for she was sailing dead into the wind. It never entered my head to attempt to attract attention, and I do not remember anything distinctly after the sight of her side until I found myself in a little cabin aft. There's a dim half memory of being lifted up onto the gangway, and of a big round countenance covered with freckles and surrounded with red hair staring at me over the bulwarks. I also had a disconnected impression of a dark face with extraordinary eyes close to mine, but that I thought was a nightmare until I met it again. I fancy I recollect some stuff being poured in between my teeth, and that is all. Chapter 2. The Man Who Was Going Nowhere. The cabin in which I found myself was small and rather untidy. A youngish man with flaxen hair, a bristly straw-colored mustache, and a dropping nether lip was sitting and holding my wrist. For a minute we stared at each other without speaking. He had watery gray eyes, oddly void of expression. Then, just overhead, came the sound like an iron bedstead being knocked about, and the low, angry growling of some large animal. At the same time the man spoke. He repeated his question. "How do you feel now?" I think I said I felt all right. Could not recollect how I had got there. He must have seen the question on my face, for my voice was inaccessible to me. "You were picked up on a boat, starving." The name on the boat was the Lady Vane, and there were spots of blood on the gunwale. At the same time my eye caught my hand, so thin that it looked like a dirty skin purse full of loose bones, and all the business of the boat came back to me. "Have some of this," he said, and gave me a dose of some scarlet stuff, iced. It tasted like blood. It made me feel stronger. "You were in luck," said he, "to get picked up by a ship with a medical man on board." He spoke with a slobbering articulation with the ghost of a lisp. "What ship is this?" I said slowly, hoarse from my long silence. "It's a little trader from Arica and Callao. I never asked where she came from in the beginning. Out of the land of born fools, I guess. I'm a passenger myself, from Arica. The silly ass who owns her, he's captain too, named Davies. He's lost his certificate or something. You know the kind of man. Calls the thing Impecacuana, of all silly infernal names. Though, when there's much of a sea without any wind, she certainly acts according." Then the noise overhead began again, a snarling growl and the voice of a human being together. Then another voice, telling some heaven-forsaken idiot to desist. "You were nearly dead," said my interlocutor. "It was a very near thing, indeed. But I've put some stuff into you now. Notice your arm sore? Injections." You've been insensible for nearly 30 hours, I thought slowly. I was distracted now by the yelping of a number of dogs. Am I eligible for solid food? I asked. Thanks to me, he said. Even now the mutton is boiling. Yes, I said with assurance. I could eat some mutton. But, said he with a momentary hesitation, you know I'm dying to hear of how you came to be alone in that boat. Damn that howling thing. I thought I detected a certain suspicion in his eyes. He suddenly left the cabin, and I heard him in violent controversy with someone who seemed to talk gibberish in response to him. The matter sounded as though it ended in blows, but in that I thought my ears were mistaken. Then he shouted at the dogs and returned to the cabin. Well, he said in the doorway, you were just beginning to tell me. And how I had taken to natural history as a relief from the dullness of my comfortable independence. He seemed interested in this. I've done some science myself. I did my biology at University College. Getting out the ovary of the earthworm and the radula of the snail and all that. Lord, it's 10 years ago. But go on. Tell me about the boat. He was evidently satisfied with the frankness of my story, which I told in concise sentences enough, for I felt horribly weak, and when it was finished he reverted at once to the topic of natural history and his own biological studies. He began to question me closely about Tottenham Court Road and Gower Street. Is Kaplatzi still flourishing? What a shop that was. He had evidently been a very ordinary medical student and drifted incontinently to the topic of the music halls. He told me some anecdotes. Left it all, he said. 10 years ago now. How jolly it all used to be. But I made a young ass of myself. Played myself out before I was 21. I dare say it's all different now. But I must look up that ass of a cook and see what he's done to your mutton. The growling overhead was renewed, so suddenly and with so much savage anger that it startled me. What's that? I called after him, but the door had closed. He came back again with the boiled mutton, and I was so excited by the appetizing smell of it I forgot the noise of the beast that had troubled me. After a day of alternate sleep and feeding, I was so far recovered as to be able to get from my bunk to the scuttle and see the green seas trying to keep pace with us. I judged the schooner was running before the wind. Montgomery, that was the name of the flaxen-haired man, came in again as I stood there, and I asked him for some clothes. He lent me some duck things of his own, for those I had worn in the boat had been thrown overboard. They were rather loose for me, for he was large and long in his limbs. He told me casually that the captain was 3 parts drunk in his own cabin. As I assumed the clothes, I began asking him some questions about the destination of the ship. He said the ship was bound to Hawaii, but that it had to land him first. Where? I said. It's an island where I live. So far as I know, it hasn't got a name. He stared at me with his nether lip drooping and looked so willfully stupid of a sudden that it came into my head that he desired to avoid my questions. I had the discretion to ask no more. Well, did you make it to the end? certainly hope you did. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing and hit that like button. It helps me out a lot. And I will see you next time in Morbid Whispers, House of Dreams.